The video that triggered backlash wasn't just controversial. It exposed a rare moment where criticism came from inside the president's own political camp, and it forced the White House to quietly reverse course within hours. A senior Republican senator who previously backed the president's campaign publicly urged the removal of a post shared by the president himself, calling it the most offensive thing he had seen from this administration. What made this moment unusual wasn't only the reaction. It was who spoke up, how fast the response escalated, and why the White House later shifted its explanation. And the full context behind that shift reveals far more than a single social media post. The controversy began late Thursday night when President Donald Trump shared a short video on his Truth Social account. According to publicly available information, the video was roughly 1 minute long and centered on familiar claims about the 2020 U.S. election. Claims that have been repeatedly disputed by courts, election officials, and bipartisan investigations. But it wasn't the broader theme of the video that immediately drew attention. It was the final seconds. In those closing moments, the video used edited imagery involving former President Barack Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama. The depiction relied on a visual metaphor that many viewers and advocacy groups quickly described as deeply offensive, particularly given long-standing historical associations tied to racial dehumanization. The clip spread rapidly across social platforms, not because it introduced new political claims, but because of how it framed familiar figures in a way many considered inappropriate and harmful. Within hours, reactions began to pour in, not just from political opponents, but from members of the president's own party. Among the first high-profile figures to respond was Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. Scott, a Republican senator and former presidential candidate, had endorsed Trump during the 2024 campaign after exiting the primary race. In a public post, Scott expressed disbelief at what he had seen. Using careful language, he said he hoped the video was not real, adding that if it was authentic, it represented the most offensive content he had personally observed coming from the White House. He urged that the post be removed. This moment stood out for several reasons. First, Scott is one of the most prominent Black Republicans in national politics. Second, he had previously aligned himself with the president politically. And third, public criticism from within the party, especially on an issue tied to racial imagery, is relatively rare. That combination gave the response additional weight and visibility, and it ensured the story would not stay confined to partisan disagreement. As the clip continued circulating, criticism expanded across the political spectrum. Democratic leaders, including House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, condemned the imagery and praised the Obamas as public servants who represent American civic values. Several state officials and party organizations echoed similar sentiments, calling on Republican leaders to denounce the post and clarify their positions. At the same time, some Republican lawmakers also began speaking out. Congressman Mike Lawler of New York stated that the post was offensive regardless of intent and said it should be removed along with an apology. The key detail here is speed. This was not a slow-burn controversy that developed over days. The reaction intensified within hours. And that urgency forced the White House to respond sooner than it typically does to online criticism. Initially, the White House defended the post. In a statement provided to the press, the administration described the video as an internet meme, portraying political figures as fictional characters, dismissing the backlash as exaggerated. The language framed the criticism as misplaced outrage and encouraged the media to focus on other issues. But that explanation did not settle the situation. As criticism continued, including from within the president's own party, the post was quietly deleted. Shortly afterward, a second statement was released. This time, the White House said the video had been shared in error by a staff member and confirmed it had been taken down. That shift, from defense to correction, became one of the most closely examined aspects of the story. Because it raised a larger question, was this a simple mistake or a reaction to mounting political pressure? And to understand why that question matters, the context surrounding the imagery itself becomes essential. The reason the video drew such strong reactions wasn't only about politics. According to historians and civil rights organizations, certain visual comparisons have been used in the past to strip dignity from black individuals and justify discrimination. Those associations are widely recognized in academic and historical discussions, especially in the context of American history. Because of that background, even indirect or symbolic uses of similar imagery can carry meanings that go beyond intent. This is why several critics noted the timing of the post, which appeared during Black History Month, a period meant to reflect on the contributions and experiences of Black Americans. Supporters of the Obamas pointed out that such depictions do not exist in a vacuum, and that public figures have a responsibility to understand how messages may be received, regardless of their stated purpose. For some observers, this moment felt familiar. President Trump has previously been criticized for comments and claims involving political opponents and public figures of color. During Barack Obama's presidency, Trump was a prominent promoter of false claims questioning Obama's birthplace, allegations that were repeatedly disproven. Those claims later became known as the birther conspiracy, which many viewed as rooted in racial and cultural suspicion rather than evidence. Michelle Obama later wrote about the personal impact of those years, describing how the rhetoric caused fear for her family and children and how she viewed it as both reckless and harmful. Because of that history, critics argue that the recent video did not appear in isolation, but as part of a longer pattern of behavior. Supporters of the president, however, argue that intent matters and that online content is often misinterpreted or amplified beyond its original purpose. That divide is where the conversation now sits. At this stage, the question is no longer just about a single, deleted post. It's about accountability, internal party boundaries, and how modern political messaging collides with history, symbolism, and public responsibility. And in the next part, we'll look at why this moment may signal a shift in how members of the president's own party respond publicly, and what it could mean heading into the next election cycle. Public criticism from political opponents is expected. In modern American politics, it is almost routine. What makes this moment different is where the criticism came from. Senator Tim Scott's response did not come from a rival party, an activist group, or a media commentator. It came from someone who had recently stood on the same campaign stage, supported the same presidential run, and defended many of the same policy goals. In political terms, that changes the calculation. When criticism comes from inside the same coalition, it is harder to dismiss as partisan noise. It signals discomfort, not just with public reaction, but with how the message itself aligns with the party's broader goals. Several political analysts noted that Scott's wording was especially careful. He did not speculate on intent. He did not assign motive. He focused on impact, and by urging the post's removal rather than escalation, he framed the issue as one of responsibility, not retaliation. That distinction matters in moments like this, because it suggests the concern was not about winning an argument, but about drawing a boundary. Another key detail is timing. From the moment the video began circulating widely, the window for response narrowed rapidly. In today's media environment, narratives form quickly. Once a story crosses from online platforms into mainstream coverage, responses are often interpreted less by what they say and more by how long they took to arrive. The initial White House response attempted to minimize the controversy, but the follow-up statement, acknowledging the post's removal and attributing it to a staff error, suggests that internal reassessment happened quickly. That pivot is notable, not because it proves intent one way or another, but because it reflects awareness of political cost. In previous cycles, similar controversies often remained online longer, even amid criticism. This time, the reversal came within a single news cycle. For some observers, that signals a heightened sensitivity to optics. For others, it raises questions about consistency, and that leads to a deeper issue: how much control political leaders truly exercise over the content shared in their name. Social platforms are no longer just communication tools. They are policy signals. They are campaign messaging. They are, in many ways, extensions of official voice. That is why explanations involving staff errors often receive scrutiny. While it is common for teams to manage accounts, responsibility still flows upward, especially when posts come from accounts that represent the highest office in the country. This incident highlights a broader challenge faced by modern administrations, balancing speed, engagement, and oversight. Content designed to energize supporters can also alienate others, particularly when symbolism is involved, and once something is shared, it cannot be unseen. Even when deleted, screenshots and recordings preserve the moment, which is why many commentators argue that deletion alone does not resolve the underlying concern. It simply stops further spread. Barack and Michelle Obama continue to occupy a unique position in American public life. They are no longer in office, yet they remain among the most recognizable political figures in the world. Supporters view them as symbols of progress, stability, and civic engagement. Critics view them as enduring representations of policies and cultural shifts they oppose. Because of that visibility, references to the Obamas often carry outsized impact. Even indirect or symbolic portrayals are interpreted through years of political and cultural context. That reality amplifies reactions, both positive and negative, and it explains why depictions involving the Obamas often trigger responses that extend beyond ordinary political disagreement. One of the most complex aspects of this story is the gap between intent and interpretation. Supporters of the video's framing argue it was meant as satire or exaggeration within a political narrative. Critics argue that history shapes meaning. Regardless of intent, this tension is not new. Throughout modern political discourse, imagery and language have often carried unintended consequences because of their historical associations. What may appear neutral to one audience can feel deeply personal to another. That is why many public figures rely on protective language and careful framing, not to avoid disagreement, but to avoid crossing lines that distract from substantive debate. In this case, the reaction suggests that for many viewers, that line had been crossed. Another revealing aspect of this episode is who didn't speak. While some Republican lawmakers addressed the issue directly, others chose not to comment publicly. That silence can be interpreted in different ways. Some may view it as strategic avoidance, waiting for the news cycle to pass. Others may see it as quiet disagreement or internal uncertainty, and some may simply view it as prioritization of other issues. In politics, silence is rarely neutral. It often reflects calculation. And when contrasted with the voices that did speak, particularly those within the same party, it highlights internal differences in how boundaries are defined. This incident may not fundamentally change political alliances or voter behavior on its own, but it does reveal pressure points. It shows where messaging risks overshadowing policy. It shows where coalition unity becomes fragile, and it shows how quickly digital content can trigger consequences beyond its original scope. As the next election cycle approaches, moments like this may become more frequent, not less. The incentive to generate attention remains strong, but so does the cost of miscalculation. At this stage, the controversy has moved beyond a single post and into a broader conversation about responsibility, symbolism, and political limits. In the final part, we'll examine what this episode could mean for future campaign strategy, internal party discipline, and the evolving expectations placed on public leaders in the digital age, and why similar moments may shape political narratives going forward. One of the most revealing outcomes of this episode is not the backlash itself, but how quickly certain political figures created visible distance. In modern politics, alignment is often expressed through silence, timing, or carefully chosen words rather than direct confrontation. Senator Tim Scott's response stood out precisely because it broke that pattern. By speaking quickly and clearly, he established a line between political support and personal responsibility. He did not question policy. He did not reference elections or strategy. He addressed conduct. That distinction allows political figures to maintain ideological alignment while signaling ethical boundaries. For party leaders, this kind of separation can be a form of risk management, an effort to prevent a single moment from defining a broader agenda. And as campaigns increasingly depend on coalition building, those internal signals carry growing importance. Campaigns today operate in an environment where every message is instantly archived, analyzed, and redistributed. Unlike previous decades, there's little separation between informal content and official messaging. A post meant to energize one audience can quickly become a liability with another. This creates a strategic dilemma. How do campaigns maintain emotional engagement without crossing lines that alienate moderates or trigger internal resistance? Moments like this one highlight the difficulty of threading that needle. They also explain why political teams increasingly rely on rapid response units, layered approvals, and post-publication monitoring. Even then, the margin for error remains small. The removal of the video closed one chapter, but it did not erase the narrative. In digital culture, deletion often signals acknowledgement rather than resolution. For critics, it confirmed that the content was problematic. For supporters, it raised concerns about pressure and overcorrection. For undecided observers, it created uncertainty. And uncertainty is often where political meaning forms. This is why controversies tied to symbolism tend to linger longer than those tied to technical errors or policy disputes. They are interpreted emotionally, historically, and personally, all at once. Another reason this moment resonated is because it connects to unresolved debates from the past. The birther controversy, now widely discredited, remains a reference point in discussions about how political rhetoric can influence public perception and personal safety. Michelle Obama's reflections on that period, shared in her memoir, reframed those years not as abstract political disagreement, but as lived experience. That perspective reshaped how many people interpret subsequent events. When new incidents echo old patterns, even indirectly, they tend to be viewed cumulatively rather than individually, and that accumulation shapes reputations. Perhaps the most important takeaway from this episode is how expectations have changed. Public figures are no longer judged only by policy outcomes or formal speeches. They are judged by what they share, what they amplify, what they allow to remain visible. This expands the definition of leadership. It places greater emphasis on judgment, restraint, and awareness of historical context. And it means that symbolic actions can carry consequences equal to legislative ones, especially in moments of heightened cultural sensitivity. It is unlikely that this single incident will redefine political alliances overnight, but it may influence how future messages are crafted, reviewed, and defended. It may also encourage more members within political coalitions to speak up when they believe boundaries have been crossed, even at the risk of short-term discomfort. In that sense, the episode becomes less about a video and more about evolving norms. Norms around accountability, norms around symbolism, norms around the responsibility that comes with reach. This story isn't ultimately about a post that was shared and deleted. It's about how power, history, and communication intersect in the digital age, and how quickly those intersections can reshape narratives. As campaigns move forward, the real question isn't whether controversies will happen. It's how leaders respond when they do, and who is willing to draw lines when silence would be easier. Because sometimes the most important changes aren't announced, they're implied.